Good afternoon. Thanks for coming today to this installment of our speaker series. I'm Ryan Streeter, the director of the Center for Politics and Governance here at UT, and it's my distinct privilege to introduce our speaker to you today. Harry Enten is a senior writer at the FiveThirtyEight political blog, which if you're into politics, you probably know the site well. He's been with them for a few years, wrote for The Guardian before that, is a graduate of Dartmouth College and a native of the Bronx. He's deep into the numbers in this crazy election cycle, and so what I'm going to do is turn it over to him so he can tell you what he sees going on in this election season that we're all trying to understand. So please join me in welcoming Harry Enten.
Oh, wow. Let's see if he can. Oh, wow. Wow, this is really loud. And I have a loud voice, a booming voice anyway, so if you become deaf, please sue the university, not myself. We're going to start off with a tape if we can figure out. Oh, wow. Okay, there we go.
What's up, fans? This has been a really tough year, guys, for predictors like myself. I screwed up a lot. On August 11th, I wrote, "The Bernie Sanders surge appears to be over." A few days later, he jumped in the lead in New Hampshire. In early February, three of my favorites for the GOP nomination were Jeb Bush, followed by Scott Walker, and Rick Perry wasn't too far behind. Scott Walker, first Republican to drop out of the race. Ted Cruz is all the way down at 1%. What the heck was I thinking? In late January, I said that Bobby Jindal was probably not going to enter the race for president. He did enter, although he probably shouldn't have. On September 25th, I wrote an article on how Bobby Jindal could still win Iowa. And Bobby Jindal, who is he again? Harry. In early May, I wrote that Chris Christie's lanes to the Republican nomination were pretty much all closed. I f***ed that one up. Here's a headline I wrote: "Why Donald Trump's not a real candidate," in one chart. Two good reasons not to take the Donald Trump surge seriously. Was the second debate the beginning of the end for Donald Trump? Wrong. Wrong again. Mother! On December 15th, I predicted that Donald Trump would drop out of the race before Mike Huckabee. Better luck next year, Harry. Where I'm going to get everything right.
So essentially what I'm going to do here is talk for 20 to 30 minutes. We'll see how long this New York accent can hold out on you guys. And then we'll take some Q&A and we'll have some fun. And if there's anything along the way where I say something and someone feels the need to scream out, please feel free to do so. That's the New York way. I'm not really sure of the Texas way, as I'm just a good old Yankee boy. But I hate the New York Yankees. I want to make that clear for the record.
All right, good start.
There you go. So I'm really going to talk mostly about Donald Trump here just because I think he's the most fascinating figure, and just kind of go through how I screwed up and then maybe kind of caught myself and then maybe screwed up again, and sort of what I was going through, and then sort of looking ahead to obviously Tuesday with Indiana and the rest of the Republican primary season, and then we'll kind of do a little bit on the general election, but I'm going to leave most of that for the Q&A. So one of the things that was most fascinating to me, which when Donald Trump entered, why I did not think he was a serious candidate in one chart, was we can look at the favorable ratings of the candidates. You know, the polls ask these questions. Do you have a favorable or unfavorable view? And the idea being that, okay, even if candidate, say, is leading in a 17-person field, and it was 17 people, with, say, 10 or 15%, which was where Donald Trump was at, does he have a ceiling? We've heard this throughout the campaign. Donald Trump has a ceiling. Donald Trump has a ceiling at 20. Donald Trump has a ceiling at 25, blah, 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 blah. And then he wins 55% of the vote in the Northeast this past week, or 65 or 66% of the vote in Rhode Island. And you're going, oh, wow, that ceiling really doesn't exist. But the favorability ratings. And when Donald Trump entered, I went back and I looked at all of the favorability ratings of all the different candidates who have ever ran. George Bush, Ronald Reagan, David Duke. Some of you might have even heard of David Duke, who may have been compared to Donald Trump on occasion, which I think is a somewhat unfair comparison, if for no other reason than David Duke never registered anything in any real primary poll, while Donald Trump clearly has done so. And so I looked at all of these ratings. I looked at all of them. And it turns out that when you look at the name recognition, this was back last June, the name recognition, which Donald Trump obviously had a lot of because Donald Trump manages to put his name on everything. I'm surprised he doesn't have his name on this water. Donald Trump had the lowest net favorability rating of anyone who ever ran for president in the last 40 years. This is unbelievable, right? So I go, wow, you look at this. He's least liked than Al Sharpton was among the Democrats in 2004. And Al Sharpton there were not many fans of Al Sharpton in the white community back in 2004. But, and I go, there's just no chance that Donald Trump can possibly win this nomination. And I went on the radio and I declared, this is a joke. I love putting up clips of Donald Trump being in Home Alone 2, you know, his great cameo in that, which he's there. You can go back and you can see he does a little scene with Macaulay Culkin. And I said, there's just no way that Donald Trump could possibly win. So Donald Trump enters, he comes down on his escalator, and we're all thinking, oh, this is the biggest joke since Howdy Do. No one will ever believe this garbage that he's spouting. You know, he is the equivalent of somebody, you know, basically, and I can use this word as a Jewish American, he was like a shyster. He seemed like a shyster to me, all right? I know shysters, you know. And I'm going, man, this guy, whew. But sure enough, he enters. And what happens when he enters? We all thought that someone who was this hated among Republican voters, that viewpoint was locked in. What we didn't recognize, of course, was that it wasn't locked in. And as soon as he enters, the first polls that were taken in July that again then asked, do you have a favorable or unfavorable view? Instead of Trump having a favorable view of 20% and an unfavorable view among Republicans of 70%, all of a sudden it flipped and it became 55% with a favorable view and say about 40% with an unfavorable view. And I think that was one of the big mistakes that we kind of made throughout this primary season was we were stuck in this past model. We kind of thought to ourselves, oh, things can't change. And then we kind of kept going back to these pieces that we had written without recognizing that, in fact, things had changed. That all of a sudden Donald Trump was viewed as a different candidate. Maybe his unfavorable views were so high because no one ever thought he was going to run. And then he did, and they recognized him for being this true sort of Republican. And, you know, one of the things that was also very interesting to me in terms of, I go back and I look at the polls and, you know, when I look at the July numbers and I say, okay, Donald Trump, if you look at Donald Trump and Jeb Bush's favorable ratings back in July, this is a long time ago when idiots like myself thought that Jeb Bush was somehow going to possibly be the Republican nominee. And then, of course, Jeb Bush obviously is not going to be the Republican nominee. And another thing that was so interesting to me in sort of this 17 candidate field, right, or 16 or 15 or whatever, now we're down to 3 obviously, but there were a lot of candidates in there, is that the favorable ratings that a lot of us were citing that he's so disliked, what we didn't recognize was that in a field that was so large, you didn't need a large percentage of the vote to win. I'll get into this a little bit later, but just the idea being that if you have this core base of supporters in a very large field, that can be good enough to win. In fact, I was just back at the hotel room, I was just looking at this. And it turns out that even when Jeb Bush's favorable rating was higher than Donald Trump's by a fairly significant 10 to 15 points, the strongly favorable ratings, that is, those people who essentially would lie down on an ice-covered road and then allow spikes being thrown into you, for Donald Trump, were in fact higher than they were for Jeb Bush. There was clearly this core amount of support that Donald Trump had that I don't think a lot of us recognized early on, where there were these people who really just liked what he was saying, and we just didn't catch on to it. So, you know, I'll put another thing that I think is also very interesting is when we were looking at these early polls and we said, oh, you know, someone who's this liked this Trump can't possibly win. So we were taking these part of the early polls, right? And we're saying we're making a big mountain out of this. Oh, you know, even though his favorable rating is X, you know, there's no way he can possibly win with this. And at the same time, we looked at the horse race polls, which by about August, all of them had him winning, even with a relatively low percentage of vote, but they all had him winning. We took those and we dismissed those. We dismissed those polls and we embraced the polls that kind of validated our point of view. And I think this is something that we in the media or the election prediction industry, which seems to be becoming a thing because now, what are there, 45 different websites, there are 45 different Twitter feeds. You can basically find whatever prediction you want to find out there. Some people are getting paid, some people aren't getting paid, some people seem to be getting paid in snark. So, you know, I think, you know, that's something that we have to kind of look back upon and say, okay, was there something that we should have possibly done a little bit differently? Are there corrections that need to be made? Were we sticking to our guns for so long? And now, of course, there is one thing, though, that I think that I was not responsible. Well, actually, if you look at the number of Donald Trump articles I wrote, maybe I was responsible for it. Maybe. And I think I wrote like 3 a week or something like that for a while. I mean, it's just so interesting, right? I mean, even if you don't like his political point of view, he's entertaining. I mean, I turn on a rally, he'll say something new, or maybe he'll say something old, but somehow he'll say it in a new way. Was the amount of free media that Donald Trump got, right? I mean, this is insane. You can put on MSNBC or CNN or whatever, and they're talking about Ted Cruz, and then they have a little panel on like the side of the screen, right? And it goes, Donald Trump rally starting in 45 minutes. And literally there is a video of nothing going on the stage, and that's all that's being shown is nothing. And then they go to his speech, and it's live, and they're broadcasting these speeches live. This is, I've never seen anything like this before. You go back through the years, you just don't see anything like this. You're thinking the way that candidates get media is through raising money or spending their own money. And Donald Trump, A, hasn't spent that much money, hasn't raised that much money of his own, hasn't spent that much money of his own, hasn't raised that much money, although I have to correct the Donald. I hate to do that since he's been right about a lot of things so far, is that in fact he is not self-funding his campaign. He has in fact raised a number of millions of dollars from people throughout the country, although he doesn't like to talk about that. But the idea being that Donald Trump gets all of this free media. In fact, we went back and we looked at the amount of media coverage, the amount of media mentions essentially through like LexisNexis, and the favorable ratings of the candidates, right? And it turns out that when you look at the ratio of favorable ratings, usually those people who are better liked tend to get more coverage. I think that makes sense, right? Because they're thought of as being more competitive. If you look at the ratio between media coverage and the favorability ratings in the polls, Donald Trump has the most out of whack ratio. He gets far more media, got far more media than he should have given how well he was liked among Republican primary voters. He had, I think, the most out-of-whack ratio since Jesse Jackson in 1984, who was running for the Democrats back then, obviously. But of course, Jesse Jackson, like Donald Trump, was very well known before he entered the presidential political arena, although Jesse Jackson was better known for his politics than, say, Donald Trump, who was known for any number of things, right? Again, we can go through the list of the things that Donald Trump has endorsed: water, vitamins, movies, steaks. Oh, I really want a Donald Trump steak. If any of you have that in your freezer, please send that to me via Federal Express, because I really want to have that with some Donald Trump wine. I think that would be the ultimate dinner of the elite. So if you look at that and you just go, wow, Donald Trump is getting all this free media, and we've kind of dismissed it, but if you're in the mind of the voter every single day, right, every single day, your numbers are bound to go up, most likely, if you're saying something that isn't just atrocious. And I guess one of the things we underestimated was the stomach that people would have for things that Donald Trump would say that'd be atrocious. You trash John McCain's Vietnam record. I think there was one column by a friend of mine who basically said this is the beginning of end for Trump. I did not write that column, thankfully. I wrote many others that were terrible. But it turned out that in fact was not something Republican primary voters were willing to stomach anything, and the free media was just a huge thing. And then I would say one of the other things that came during the campaign that was really interesting to me that we kind of underestimated was this idea that political endorsements, we thought political endorsements mattered. That is, endorsements by governors, by senators, by members of the House. So if you look on our website, we had something called the endorsement primary. And in fact, if you had gone back through the years and you correlated, you built a nice little regression out of this, that, and other, turns out that endorsements were pretty a telltale sign. The more endorsements that you had, the better your chances of winning. Now, we don't know the exact relationship. Was it because people who endorsed followed the people that they thought were going to win, or was it the endorsements were a signal to voters? We didn't really know what was going to happen. But for instance, on the Democratic side, that's been a pretty telltale sign, right? Bernie Sanders really has not been endorsed by that many politicians, at least well-known politicians. And obviously, I think that was a major fault line with him, especially when it came to black voters in particular, who tend to more or less go with who the leaders in their community have voted for. That was a telltale sign that he did not, in fact, have any for Bernie Sanders, and his campaign ultimately faltered because he couldn't pick up the support of any African American. Well, he picked up obviously a few, but the vast majority of African Americans decided to go with Hillary Clinton. But on the Republican side, Donald Trump did not pick up a single endorsement until when? like among elected governors, House of Representatives, or senators? Was it like January or February, or was it March? I don't even know. January. It was January. This is insanity. He didn't pick up a single one. And so when we're looking back, I mean, you can multiply, in a regression, you have, a coefficient, you multiply it by the actual number. Well, anything times 0, for the most part is, well, it's 0, right? So Donald Trump is really not going to go very many places. But one of the things that I think we underestimated was, maybe there was this search for an outsider candidate, as someone is seeming to try and get in the door there. I didn't recognize that they would be, I was so popular. Here we go. Hello. Nice to see you. If you look back, maybe we underestimated how important these endorsements were, right? Or overestimated, how important these endorsements were. Or maybe, here's the other thing that I think was kind of key, was we were expecting this Republican cavalry to come in, save the day. Oh, they're all going to come together. They're going to come in a nice little party, and they're going to be able to stop Trump because there's going to be a unified voice. Well, I got news for you. That unified voice didn't come. It ain't coming. It's just not. Donald Trump has since now picked up endorsements. There's clearly, yes, there's this never Trump crowd, but for the most part, Republican leaders stayed on the sideline. Even when there was some kind of coalescing around Marco Rubio late in the campaign, for the most part, most of these guys stayed on the sideline. So even if you have the belief that these endorsements matter, it simply couldn't matter as much because there was no coalescing around a particular candidate. And so any real type of hope that there could be one candidate who could stop Trump kind of basically just fell apart. Now, here's the other thing that I think is kind of important, which is basically what was the main reason, though, that I think that we in the media kind of miss Trump? And I think it's because he's a different type of candidate, okay? I think when people like myself think of Republican primary voters, they put them in ideological camps. There's those moderates, and maybe, that sometimes team up with the somewhat conservatives, and then those that are very conservatives who tend to be those born-again evangelical Christians. And those are like those two camps, and we've seen that kind of fight out over the past few primaries, right? There was Rick Santorum versus Mitt Romney. There was John McCain versus Huckabee, and Romney, who was kind of also part of that very conservative, although Romney was a little bit different. There was Bob Dole versus Pat Buchanan, and these, for the most part, kind of fit a mold. And so what we try to do is put things in a mold. And so when we're looking at the polls and we're kind of talking to different people, we say, okay, I know my moderate, well-educated friends in Washington, D.C. or Manhattan, they don't like Donald Trump. I look at the polls in Iowa among these very conservative, born-again evangelical Christians, and they don't like Donald Trump, so no Donald Trump, right? But what we missed were these moderate voters, these moderate, somewhat conservative voters who were not well-educated and were not born-again evangelical Christians. And traditionally, they had gone, at least the past few cycles, with the Romneys and the McCains of the world. I'm thinking about these people who live in New Hampshire, kind of along the coastline. Maybe they're a fisherman, maybe they used to work in a mill, maybe they, these types of voters. And when your bubble in Washington, D.C. and Manhattan is that at least 80% of voters have a college degree, and Donald Trump doesn't get that much support from them. In fact, he gets support from those who don't have college degrees. Then you're stuck in this old way of thinking, and you're not talking with anybody who has this other way of thinking. And the only time that I, in all honesty, met a Donald Trump supporter was when I was coming back from Poughkeepsie, New York on a ride where a driver who worked in local politics up there, who didn't have a college degree, I don't believe, was supporting Donald Trump. And that was the first time I ever met a Donald Trump supporter in person. And as Ryan could tell you, you just talk with people in Republican circles. They didn't know any Donald Trump supporters because they just didn't simply, there was a new mold that was being built, a new coalition that we just weren't in a position to kind of catch. So I think the other thing, though, there are a lot of other things. I have a lot of things here, a lot of reasons for Trump, was that we expected at the end of the day that there would be this one candidate who would go against Trump, right? If you could get Trump into a one-on-one, you can beat him. This was the thing that we always said, if you look at, forget Donald Trump and, this 16 or 17 candidate field, say Trump versus Rubio or Trump versus Cruz or Trump versus Kasich. You can get one person against Trump, then you can beat him. Well, there were a number of problems with that line of thought, not the least of which is it's, what is it, nearly May now, and still there are 3 candidates in the race, not 1 candidate against Trump. So I think that was one basic problem, was there was never a one-on-one with Trump. But I think the other huge problem with that sort of line of thinking was that the person who ended up being the strongest candidate against Trump was Ted Cruz. Well, I got news for you. Ted Cruz ain't any more likable than Donald Trump among a number of people. You know, you talk with that Washington elite that I was kind of hinting at earlier, and they don't like Ted Cruz at all. His colleagues hate him. He's too conservative. And so these moderate voters in these suburbs who don't like Donald Trump either because of the things he says about Muslims, about immigrants, so on and so forth, they hate Ted Cruz just as much, and so they're going to cast their lot with Kasich, and you get this divided competition where Trump, for the longest time, was able to win with 40% of the vote. Meanwhile, Kasich didn't appeal at all to very conservative voters. Probably, in all honesty, in retrospect, we were right at the time. The only candidate who could have appealed to all of these camps was probably Rubio, maybe, possibly. But Rubio, at the end of the day, was liked across the spectrum, but his support was so thin, it wasn't deep enough that he just wasn't able to get on. Maybe if he had won Virginia instead of lost it by 4, who knows? But, at the end of the day, bygones be bygones. So looking forward, as we kind of sort of think, is this the dawning of a new kind of age of, a different type of Republican coalition? I think we can kind of look to Europe. They have this kind of conservative populism with Le Pen, which has been around for a while, and it's you have it with the UKIP in the UK as well. It's very possible that Trump represents at least a different type of faction. Maybe he's not going to be the Republican brand going forward. In fact, he hasn't won the nomination yet, and we'll get to that in a second. But I think that this type of voter who appeals to these more nativist type of voters it could be very interesting to see if they all of a sudden are a big voice in Republican primaries. And indeed, I would argue that perhaps we had these Tea Party revolts, right? And we thought, it's all about this brand of conservatism. We want this very deep red conservatism, without recognizing that perhaps what it was all about was this outsider voice. That was the reason that people were jumping aboard this train. They were thinking, well, we don't really care about the ideology. We like more of the way that the message is being delivered. We hate Washington. Washington isn't fighting for us. And so it'll be interesting to see if that type of thing going forward is something in Republican primaries, or is Trump basically the black swan? Who knows? The sample size is so small. All that said, I think it's important to note that Donald Trump, so far in the National Republican primary, has gotten a little less than 40% of the vote. He has not represented a majority of Republican primary voters so far. In fact, it wasn't until New York that he even got a majority of the vote in any contest taken stateside. I think was it the Northern Marianas Islands, where he managed to get the endorsement of the governor because of some deal with Ben Carson that he got sent. But in contests that had more than 500 voters in them, he struggled tremendously to get above that 50% threshold that was finally broken the past few weeks. But I think that kind of indicates that maybe, just maybe, there is this real sort of opposition to Trump within the Republican primary, at least that maybe now he's broken through the wall. We'll see what happens in Indiana. And I think that to me is going to be the big question. It's obviously on Tuesday is the Indiana primary. That's the big one, 57 delegates. If Donald Trump wins there, this thing is almost certainly over. This is a state demographically that Ted Cruz should do at least fairly well in. If Ted Cruz can win 51 of the 57 delegates, then we'll see everybody in California. I'm sure the college will pay for all of us to go out there, right? But if Donald Trump wins in Indiana on Tuesday, then I think that Donald Trump is going to be the nominee. But we'll see if this coordination stuff works, if picking Carly Fiorina, who has never actually won any general election and got 4% of the vote in New Hampshire, maybe picking a vice president somehow works, though I'm not quite sure about that. And sort of then California with the 172 with the 172 delegates, I'm thinking ahead to the general election. That's going to be the big thing, and seeing if Trump can win out there, and some of the polls indicate he's leading by more than 20 points, he can get the nomination that way. Contested convention, we'll see. At this point, I'm thinking it's not going to be. But if it does, I think the key number to watch is, can Trump get above about 1,200 delegates? pledged delegates, elected delegates. I think you prefer the term elected. If he goes into the convention with that, then he'll probably win because he'll be able to get the 100, from the 100 plus unbound delegates, he'll get enough to get to 1237. But if he's below that number, then it could be very, very interesting, in which case I will bring my gas mask to Cleveland because things could get very interesting very, very quickly. And then just in terms of the general election, and I want to open it up to some Q&A, I think one of the key things that I kind of am interested in seeing in terms of the general election, I think there are a few things that we have to keep our eye out on. Number one, the president's approval rating. Although that doesn't play as big of a factor when the president isn't running for re-election, it's basically that sort of check of, do you like the direction of things that are going? And Barack Obama's approval rating, which may surprise a lot of conservatives, has in fact been rising over the past 6 months and is regularly topping 50% or more in Gallup, which if you were to run basically a simple linear regression of the president's approval rating versus the percentage of the vote that his party's nominee gets in the fall, generally the dividing line is about 48 or 49, and Obama is now regularly getting above that line. So that could make Hillary Clinton a slight favorite in the fall. And then the two other things that I would kind of look at is Trump has frequently said that he would compete in states that Republicans don't compete in usually, like Massachusetts, where of course he's trailing by 35 percentage points to Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump says a lot of things. PolitiFact, I don't know if they can check all of them so quickly because they come a mile a minute, but doesn't look good for him there. Wisconsin, which is another state that is kind of this, blue-collar state supposedly, Trump isn't winning there. In fact, I checked this morning, in 50 consecutive national polls, Donald Trump has trailed Hillary Clinton, 5-0. There is some question about whether he can, as he focuses back to the general electorate and tries to make himself more presidential. Okay, sure, I guess that potentially could work for him. And then, he goes on stage and basically says that Hillary Clinton is only where she's at because she's a woman. And I think many women in the room would disagree, even if they don't like Hillary Clinton, would disagree with that point of view. She would do better than 5% of the vote if she were, even if she were a man, given the experience that she has. And again, you can disagree on sort of if you like her or not, but I don't think she is where she is just because she's a woman. But it's not presidential. And the thing that to me is so interesting about the general election polls is, again, if you look at that favorable, unfavorable, that comes back into the equation again. Hillary Clinton would, I think, be the least liked general election candidate for a party's nomination since probably at least Jimmy Carter at this point. Her net favorability rating, that is her favorable rating minus her unfavorable rating, regularly is at -10, or perhaps even a little bit lower, maybe -15. She'd be the least liked, I think since at least Carter, but basically it's not any good. Except there's one little tiny thing with that, is that Donald Trump's net favorability rating is regularly bottoming out at least -35 percentage points, or -40 in the case of one poll, which to me, as I was telling Ryan before, you can't beat nothing with nothing, folks. You really can't. At the end of the day, it's a choice between two candidates. And at this point, Hillary Clinton may be disliked, but Donald Trump is hated. Hated. Remember, this is the people who are voting in the Republican primary. It's like, oh my God, look at this. He's getting 55, 56, 57% of the vote in Maryland, this blue state. Do you know how many Republicans there are in Maryland? He's getting a slice of a slice of a slice, and all of a sudden this is being, extrapolated to something that is entirely not that at all. Just to make the circle beautifully complete, if you look at the strongly unfavorable ratings of Trump, right? I spoke about how he had that base of support within the Republican Party, that strongly favorable. Look at the strongly unfavorable numbers for Trump. They regularly top 50% among the general electorate. That is, he isn't just disliked. He is, as I said, hated. These are people who would travel across a 27-inch blizzard in Austin, Texas, to vote against Donald Trump. I should say, by the way, if any of you are weather buffs, and I know I am, but probably none of you, that New York City, I can say, the January blizzard, which was the second largest blizzard, they have now deemed it the largest blizzard. I'm just so proud. I love my city so much. So, basically Donald Trump really, really disliked. Obama's approval ratings are going up higher. It's going to be very interesting to see as we head into the fall whether Trump can truly transition. But my guess is, if you look back and you say, we should have believed the polls that showed that Trump was winning the Republican nomination in July, which again, he has not won. He hasn't won. We'll see what happens in Indiana and then California. If we were to believe those polls, maybe, just maybe, we should start believing the polls now for the general election, which show him to be a heavy, heavy underdog. And with that, we are now at 12:50, and we started at 12:20, and I've been yakking my brains out. So why don't we do some question and answer session, and we see, good, there are questions, so I don't just have to keep talking to myself, and we'll see what we can do.
So I know that you talked a lot about polls at different points, and I know you've written a lot about how polls, especially general election polls, aren't reliable until a specific point before an election. To what extent does that same effect apply to favorability polls, which you're basing a lot of your argument on?
Right. So if we can, in fact, we've done those studies. They are, not surprisingly, the two are quite related, right? So I think that's one of the questions that's going to be answered is, how reliable are these polls? Bye-bye, everybody. How reliable are these polls at this point? And in fact, they can change. And I think that's one of the things that we have to kind of keep an eye out for, is how much do they change? But there are other things that, to me, caution me against thinking that they're going to change too much. One of them is that strongly unfavorable rating, which I think means a lot. We don't have enough polling data on that going back too far to know how much that means, but I think that means something when it's, these aren't just soft feelings. If you look back, for instance, at the CBS News polls in '88 when Dukakis was leading after he captured the Democratic nomination, and in some cases was leading by a lot. In fact, what it was, his favorable rating never topped 40%. It was that his unfavorable rating was regularly around 10 with a lot of don't knows and undecideds. Donald Trump doesn't really have that many don't knows and undecideds. These are people who, to me, have been following this campaign for a while now. Maybe things will change as things shift to the fall, and I certainly would not discount that. But I think the fact that you have these strongly unfavorable ratings, combined with the fact that Trump has been known for a while, makes me think that maybe these numbers mean more than they might have in prior years. But we'll see.
So when Trump first started running, before he even declared his candidacy, when you were looking at the unfavorable ratings, something you mentioned in your video in the beginning, it looked like it was impossible for Trump to win the nomination because his unfavorable ratings were so high, and then they just very abruptly flipped. So is there any downside to relying on unfavorable?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I think there's a tremendous downside. I think, and the two are, as I was hinting at there, are related. I think that sometimes we take these things that we think mean something that they're not. We say, oh, this is the underlying fundamental, but in fact, not surprisingly, we always wonder, which way does the relationship go, right? Is it that people have an unfavorable view of somebody, ergo, they're not voting for them, or is it that they're not going to vote someone, so then they say that they have an unfavorable view? So I'm not necessarily sure. Again, the sample sizes, and this is something that I don't think people get to talk about a lot, is the sample sizes on presidential elections with polling data available are quite small. Even if you go back to, 48, 16 elections or 17 elections, whatever it is, and that's with just general election polling, not just with the unfavorables, which we have an even smaller sample size of. They're quite small, so things can happen that we're not used to, we haven't seen before, because, it's like, how many baseball games are there a day? 15, 16, whatever it is, 15? There's many baseball games in one day is basically number of elections that we have in this kind of polling archive that we kind of use. And no one would ever, make such a certain bet about a baseball game just based upon yesterday's results of the last 16 games. If they did, they would have thought the Washington Nationals were going to run away with the NL East, and in fact, now the Mets are only one game behind them. So, I think that we just have to be very, very careful. And so I don't want to express too much confidence. I think Donald Trump would have a legitimate shot in a general election. But saying he has a legitimate shot is not the same as saying it's 50-50. So that the odds right now on the betting markets are something like Hillary Clinton with a 70% chance and Donald Trump with a 30% chance. That means that Donald Trump has a legitimate shot, but it also means that chances are Hillary Clinton would win against Donald Trump.
So in the general election, taking into account what you said earlier about the desire for change, kind of above all.
Oh, yeah.
Is there polling that measures not the person, but the desire for change?
Sure. I mean, obviously, voters have, certainly on the Republican side, voters have said they want change. And indeed, on the Democratic side, you look at the polls after polls after polls, there's, 40% of voters who say they want to change from President Obama's policies, maybe more liberal or more conservative. So there's certainly that's going on. And for a long time, we have seen these wrong track, right direction, wrong track. I think that's how it goes, or not right track, wrong direction, whatever it is. We've seen that the wrong track numbers have gotten well near 70%. So there's clearly this desire for change, but I think that we have to say to ourselves, what type of change are people looking for, right?
Well, and I guess the question was, so one of those candidates clearly represents throwing everything.
That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true, and I think that that's something that can't be dismissed, right? But I think that if you look, for instance, who are the people who are saying that they want the most, who want a lot of change, on the Democratic side, I am a little suspicious that a lot of Democratic voters are going to go for Donald Trump. And there are, for better or worse, more Democratic voters than there are Republican voters in this country. And if you look at poll after poll in a general election, when you look at the matchup between Trump and Clinton, you see that Clinton regularly tops 90% or more of self-identified Democrats. But again, I would not dismiss it. Trump has done far better than a lot of us have thought. But I would also say that in a general election where ideology is sort of the key thing and party identification is the key thing versus in a primary where there are a lot of different moving parts, general elections have tended to be far more predictable than primaries are. Well, they better be, otherwise we're all in deep trouble given how the primary went this year.
So you mentioned earlier the betting markets, the European betting markets. First of two unrelated questions. Do you think they're within the time frame in which they're accurate? Way out, way before the elections, they're kind of discounted and later perceived to be better. Are they there yet? And then second, do you think that this is a part of the Donald Trump effect, is part of a larger demographic shift of the Republican Party
That's a good question.
towards the non-college educated whites?
Yeah. All right. I mean, in my opinion, for the most part, the betting markets reflect conventional wisdom, for better or worse, and I think that's actually a useful thing. It's a good check. But I would be suspicious about reading too much into them other than sort of they take all of the viewpoints that I've kind of been talking about and kind of saying, okay, taking all these different pieces, what do they mean? I would not now run and say Hillary Clinton's going to be the Democratic, is going to be the next president, but I think that the betting markets also reflect that with sort of 70-30. I think that's a perfectly fine odds at this point, given what we know of the different candidates and President Obama's approval rating and so on and so forth. As for the second part of your question, which is this demographic shift, I think this is really interesting, right? What we have seen among whites without a college education is a belief that nobody is talking for them. Not just to them, but for them. We have all of the, we have a party, the Republican Party traditionally has spoken about these well-to-do, people who want tax cuts, lowering, the federal deficit, although you can't do that. And that's kind of difficult when you're lowering the tax cut unless you're also cutting spending, which is something in Washington that's very difficult to do. But you have this party, and then you have a Democratic Party that seems to be talking to well-educated voters with social issues, and maybe to poorer voters with some economic issues, and then maybe talking about diversity, and they're really talking about racial diversity. They're talking to blacks and Latinos and maybe Asians, but nobody has been speaking to non-college whites. And this is something going forward, which is what is Trump's message? Well, Trump is not some radical conservative, not in the way that we traditionally talk about. He would be perfectly fine maybe with raising taxes or spending more money or doing this, that, and other, keeping Medicaid, keeping Medicare, all of this stuff. The Trump voter is not specifically ideological, and to me, it's going to be very interesting whether or not other candidates take up this mantle. Mike Huckabee kind of did that in 2008. He was not well liked by the Club for Growth. He was this kind of more populist, Republican who did well in Arkansas, who kind of reached across these party lines, and he was able to win in Arkansas. Now Arkansas is a ruby red state. It wasn't when Mike Huckabee was winning elections in the late 90s and early 2000s. So I don't know. Could this be the beginning of something new? As I kind of hinted at with Europe, in the UK and in France, it could be a sign that maybe there is the real message. It might not be for, we won't see these people running wild, but I think you might start seeing a lot of congressional candidates kind of echoing Trump on this.
So I'm looking forward to 2020 and future elections. Are there any fundamental assumptions about endorsements or favorability ratings or whatever that you're comfortable with keeping? Or do you think Trump was kind of a one-off candidate with his weird combination of name recognition and willingness to say pretty much anything?
Yeah, right. I mean, it's like, well, in the sample size in which people who host the television show The Apprentice and, appeared in Home Alone and sold these waters, that I don't know. I don't know. I would say I think what really is needed is we need to be a lot more cautious, right? I think enough of I was on a we did have this podcast. I don't know if any of you listened to that. Claire Malone is far better at it than I am. I don't get to talk nearly enough on that. Although this past Monday, after a young woman didn't treat me in a way that I thought was exactly correct, I was a little more aggressive because I didn't think I was aggressive enough on our dates. And I don't mean, in a scary way. I mean, in terms of talking. I said, I was more aggressive, but, if you look back at the tapes, what the hell was I saying in August? 0%. I mean, obviously I was, being, I wasn't actually meaning 000. I meant more in terms of, a 1 in 1,000 or whatever, but we got to be more cautious, and I think we got to be more careful with our words. And then I will go on Twitter later and be extra, extra snarky, especially the Sanders supporters who love to get in with me. But I think we'll need to be more careful.
Having interviewed David Duke and had him in a film, you're right, Donald Trump is much more fun guy to be able to be with. Though he compares really well with George Wallace's rallies in 1968.
That's a good point.
And the style is very similar, and Dan Carter had a really interesting op-ed in the Times about this. Let me ask you about the whole idea of all publicity is good publicity. Okay, I have never in my entire life seen a presidential candidate, as you said, get this kind of publicity. It's surreal.
Yeah.
Are there any studies at all? Forget the strongly dislike or whatever.
Whatever, yeah, go
ahead. Are there any studies at all in terms of the fact that, granted, most voters are not concentrated on this all day long. And this is not just the people that haven't gone to college. People have other things to think about. So what's the relationship between the incredible amount of publicity and the name recognition factor, so that if you have an election between two incredibly not liked candidates, because a lot of Democrats right now are going, oh great, this is Trump, we'll beat him easily. And I'm assuming that this is going to close, and as the specter of a Trump possible candidacy gets cloned, the chaos is going to get crazier. Is there any research out there in terms of amount of publicity and the possibility of some getting a vote, forgetting about what people actually think about the personalities?
It's a good question, and I want to hit on a bunch of things that you kind of spoke about. And that, first I want to talk about Wallace, and then I want to get to the rest. I think George Wallace is a great example, and I think you mentioned that piece where they basically said if they had CNN going, 24/7, Wallace would have easily won, at least in '72 when he was running in the Democratic primary. But I think Wallace is a good example in terms of what did Wallace kind of appeal to was this working class kind of voter. And not necessarily religious, and that's the big difference, like between a Pat Buchanan who kind of, sort of, maybe, kind of echoed that kind of same type of working class resentment in 1996 and in 1992, but you strip away the religious part of it, and then all of a sudden, wow, that appeals to a lot more people. But in terms of press coverage, yeah, there are studies that show, that press coverage, the more press coverage you get, the better that you will do regardless of that. But most of those are concentrated on these very low races, right? We haven't dealt with this in a presidential campaign before, so it's very tough to extrapolate exactly what's going to happen. But I think one of the key things is, in at least a presidential election, is that so many votes at this point are so locked in based solely on partisan identification. The question is, among that independent group, or those people who kind of make up their mind, can just seeing Trump make a difference? It could. It could. Why couldn't it? Why couldn't it? And I think a lot of Democrats have been, ooh, Trump, Trump, Trump. And in fact, maybe I should vote, in these open primaries. Maybe I should vote in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary so that I can elevate Trump so he can face. I think that's just a very dangerous game if you're a Democrat. I think it's a very dangerous game. If Trump has been able to, all of a sudden has been convincing these Republicans who might have been more opposed to him, and now you hear Bob Corker, who's supposedly this policy wonk, who is not very conservative at all, saying that Trump's speech yesterday was, fantastic. He really laid out the specifics. If he can convince Bob Corker, who says he can't start convincing, some people who otherwise you would say no way he'd vote for Trump. So I'd be very, very careful about that.
You opened up the segment by talking about not only your failures, but the failures of other prediction, organizations to really understand what was going on during this election cycle. Is there something? What are the key takeaways that these prediction organizations, not just FiveThirtyEight,
Sure.
obviously, is there? What are the key takeaways? I guess you could say that these organizations really need to, learn from this cycle in order to maintain their relevance for upcoming election cycles. And
Fortunately, looking at the traffic numbers, we won't have any real problem with that. But I would say that there are a few things that we would do. One, I mentioned about being cautious. I think two is not looking at things in many different ways. So not, we had this endorsement primary, which I still think is very useful, but, not just dismissing other things. Three is I would be very interested in, people like Byron York, who kind of, was a reporter with the Washington Examiner, who, went out on the trail. And, I think that there are some types of on-the-trail stories that aren't very useful. I was at that Jeb Bush rally. Guys, he is back, believe it or not. That's a true story. That was an actual thing. I wouldn't dismiss Jeb. I mean, maybe we shouldn't have dismissed Jeb Bush, but clearly that wasn't getting it was going on. But I think if there's some way going forward where we could really meld smart qualitative reporting with the quantitative side, especially when you have these small sample sizes, I think that could be very, very helpful. I don't think that it should be, in baseball, for instance, where we've kind of gone through the sabermetric revolution, where it was the quants versus the scouts. But eventually what ended up happening was there was a great fusing of those two ideas. And I think we haven't quite got there on the politics side yet. And I'd be very interested to see how we can exactly do that. If nothing else, Dave Weigel is no longer as snarky to me. I met him in person. Actually a very nice guy. And now we're snarky together on Twitter and we retweet one another. But I think that type of thing going forward could be very, very helpful. We'll get to you. Don't worry. We're not leaving until you get your question.
So in light of the growing number of Americans who identify as independents and the unusual situation where the most likely general election matchup would be two candidates who have strong negative net favorability ratings,
That's an
does
understatement.
it not make sense to have a nonpartisan primary so that both extremist candidates and deeply distrusted candidates don't get very far in the system?
So you're talking like a top two party, top two primary in California or a jungle primary in Louisiana, that type of idea. Sure, it's never going to, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your viewpoint, it's never going to happen. I think it could make a lot of sense. But I think one of the things that has kind of been missed, we've heard all this stuff from the Bernie Sanders folks. Oh, New York was a closed primary. You're depriving people of their democratic right. I don't think anyone's going to argue that. Maybe you should allow people to re-register, sooner or later than, October before the April election. I mean, it's a really long time. But at the end of the day, parties are not, they're not necessarily democratic. They are parties. They can do what they want to do. Now, some states may try and set up different systems. Obviously, we see that in California, Washington, Louisiana, and then some individual cities with their mayoral elections. But parties can do what they want to do for the most part. And so, unfortunately, I don't think that that's really a possibility. But one of the questions that I would have going forward is we've often dismissed third-party runs, right? I think it was Jim Vandehei who had some piece, was it in the Wall Street Journal, which this past week about a third-party run and kind of described who would be the third-party candidate. And it was widely mocked for any number of reasons. I did not do any mocking, but I let, some other people did the mocking, and then maybe I favorited a few of their tweets. But I would say that there is, if you can find the right candidate, especially given how despised people are, how despised the two candidates are, in the right formula, there could be a third-party candidate, but it has to be the right one. And we just haven't seen that right one come along in a while. So we'll see.
All right, I have two questions.
Yes.
First one is basically if there were only 4 candidates running instead of 15, 17, whatever, do you think we would be where we are today with Donald Trump? And then the second one is what is your thought on technology and these free trade agreements, you know, as affecting citizens who have to retool every, I don't know, 5 years for new skills and things of that nature? You just are not secure anymore as far as jobs are concerned.
Yeah. So I think the question is, who were those 4, right? I mean, if it was Jim Gilmore as one of the 4, I don't think, Jim Gilmore would have appealed to that too many people, though I still believe Jim Gilmore has a lot to offer. I think it could have been very different. For one thing, there were all these people who wanted to so badly get into this one-on-one with Trump that they were spending money against the other guys. Like, how much money did Jeb Bush's super PAC spend against Marco Rubio? It's almost unbelievable that Rubio even made it to the Final Four, given how much money that was spent against him. But it's an alternative universe, and I don't know the answer, but I do think it could have been very, very different. I think it would have, if nothing else, Trump couldn't have won in South Carolina with 32% of the vote or 35% of the vote in New Hampshire, and then all of a sudden, momentum builds momentum, and a runaway train, which seems to potentially be what we're dealing with right now, again, pending Indiana. I think it could have been different, but it wasn't. In terms of your second question, I think, you could tie that in to sort of what we're seeing, why Donald Trump is doing so well, is these people who are so upset with the technological change that we've had in these free trade agreements, which they believe, rightly or wrongly, have taken jobs away from them, and it builds this anger up. And an anger that, for the most part, has not been addressed by people in Washington. So, for instance, you have, Barack Obama agreeing to free trade agreements. You have a lot of Republicans wanting free trade agreements. Well, what about those people who don't want those free trade agreements? We've clearly seen with Bernie Sanders, he was against that free trade agreements, TEA, whatever, whatever, yeah. There's so many, the acronyms that they get them in. But, and then all of a sudden Hillary Clinton kind of has to slide because she sees where the wind is. Or Donald Trump being against. There's clearly this want within the American electorate of candidates who, at least, even if they don't, dislike free trade, they're still willing to listen and recognize that for some people, there really is this very, very hatred, I would say, in some cases.
So there's been a lot of talk about how media coverage has played into this Trump phenomenon, so to speak. 538 is a political prediction organization, but it's also a media organization.
It is.
So how is there a directive from the top about the conversation of playing into this phenomenon and being part of the cycle of a story, more viewers, more stories, versus not playing into it, but your viewers.
Sure. So the president of ESPN is John Skipper, and he regularly sends us daily directives of how to run our website. No. And I should say that Skipper actually, I believe, stole a cab from me as I was going to Newark Airport yesterday. I swear to God. He claimed he got there first. I think he's full of, but I let him take it because he could fire me.
I guess I meant more among Nate and Micah.
Yeah, of course. There's not some grand thing. I mean, sure, I actually refuse to look at my traffic numbers. That's mostly because I'm too ultra competitive. I know if I look once, it's all over. But there's interesting, good stories. Now, that doesn't mean that traffic doesn't play a part in it, but to be honest, the things that really move traffic are the Bernie Sanders stories. If you put a pro Bernie Sanders story up this cycle, oh my God! It's like the balloons come down from the ceiling. We pop the cork. We can pay for another year of salary, guys. But yeah, I mean, obviously you want to talk about what's interesting, and I think you can't blame the media too much insofar as that people want to talk about Trump, and so you give people what they want. But I mean, at the end of the day, I'm always looking for the hot take. Ooh. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that there's a directive, but I would say, of course, that the people are looking at that type of stuff, and to say otherwise would be silly and foolish and be a lie. And I don't like to lie, unlike Ted Cruz.
One, maybe two more.
So this is a question that isn't about Donald Trump.
Oh my.
To me, one of the most interesting things about this cycle is how wide open the Republican primary process was and how closed comparatively the Democratic primary was, with really only 3 candidates ever throwing their hats in the ring and one not getting any traction. How do you explain that?
Well, I would explain it in a few ways. And of course, I don't want to forget about our dear friends Lincoln Chafee and Jim Webb. Come on, they ran too. There was a metric system discussion that went on, and maybe a discussion about Andrew Jackson being on the $20 bill if you're Jim Webb. And unfortunately, I don't have time to get into my Alexander Hamilton story and Jack Lew. But I would say what was really going on is that I spoke about that invisible primary earlier, right? The endorsements. There was such a quick coalescing around Clinton on the Democratic side. I mean, she got more endorsements more quickly than anybody we've ever seen in recorded history. There was clearly this belief that Hillary Clinton should be the Democratic nominee, and anyone who goes after Hillary Clinton better watch their back because things are going to get very bad very, 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 very quickly. While on the Republican side, with Trump, I talk about the endorsements, but again, as I also mentioned, there was no one who was really endorsing anybody. There was no idea of who was the strongest candidate. Should there be this coalescing around anybody? No one really understood what was going on, which I think was the perfect formula for somebody who got all this media coverage to be able to come out and just start steamrolling, because the idea that there was this establishment, there was no establishment. There is no real establishment anyway, but these party actors being able to stop somebody, it just wasn't there, and so there was this wide open lane, and a bunch of people decided that they were going to run. Do we have one more quick one?
Yeah. We'll take one more quickly, and then we'll be on our way.
Oh, we're doubling up, I see.
So I've lived in Texas for a couple of years now, but I'm originally from the New York area. And
where in the New York area?
Westport, Southern Connecticut.
I know Westport. My uncle used to have a home in Westport. Hillary Clinton won 70.3% of the vote, I think, in Westport.
Yeah. Like 75-25. And we were one of the 6 towns in the state that Kasich won.
Hey, yeah. But, rich people.
Yeah, exactly. That actually does lead into my question. So what you hear about the Trump demographics tend to be, lower educated, lower income, white voters.
Yeah.
And that's why people, even the FiveThirtyEight delegate tracker, are you on track for the nomination thing? If you look at Marco Rubio's flatline or John Kasich's flatline, they both say they need to do really well in those areas of the Northeast. But when I was checking the Connecticut primary results last week, you see Trump winning places like Greenwich, Connecticut, which they were a football rival, so I love that.
Sure.
But on the other hand, why is Trump winning Greenwich, Connecticut? Why is Trump doing well in Westchester County? So I'm wondering if there's any kind of change in the way Republicans in the Northeast are talking about?
Sure. I would say a few things. One is, relatively speaking, Trump still does worse among those well-to-do voters. I would also say, though, a rising tide lifts all boats. If you're doing 60% of it, you may not be doing as well in Greenwich, but you're still going to be doing fairly well if you're getting 60% of the vote, but it's just relatively speaking. But I think that there might have finally been he was able to break through this wall whereby voters have just decided enough is enough. We got to get ready for the fall. But I would also mention another thing, which is that there are a lot fewer votes now on the Republican side in these well-to-do areas than there used to be. A lot of these voters are now voting in Democratic primaries because the education level has become more predictive of the party identification than of being the wealthier. And I think that's why you saw, for instance, Trump did really, really poorly on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, but there were so few Republican votes there that he was able to, he still lost Manhattan, but barely lost it to John Kasich, versus Hillary Clinton was racking up these huge vote totals on the Upper East Side, which in fact was her best areas in New York City were not the African-American neighborhoods, they were the wealthy white areas, which is a very interesting coalition. But
Well, this hour has flown by. I'm sorry to have to cut us off. I know we could probably continue. If you'd like to sign up for future events, you're not on our list, please stop and see Lauren or Hen on the way out. And we do have Will Howell from the University of Chicago here next Tuesday, I believe it is, May 3rd, to talk about his book, Relic, which argues that the Constitution is weak and we need a stronger executive. So we do nothing if not promote some controversy here. But right now, just join me in thanking Harry. Harry, this was great. Thanks so much.